Welcome back to Deep Thoughts. I can't believe it, but it's like 90 degrees outside on an October day. And just had a big 12-hour meeting yesterday on a script. So I'm going to record a show today. Put out 2 this afternoon. Jealousy and video games of today. Slightly windy today, but I don't think it's the kind of gusty wind that will end up in the microphone. So I was at my cigar lounge the other day, and one of our regulars was looking at something we were playing about, fake space station stuff, and a bunch of this fake rah-rah, we went to the moon crap. And this dude, if he's not in his 70s, he's just on the cusp. And he's like, he's totally awake. He knows what's going on. But he said something interesting that I hear every once in a while. And I'm not sure what my exact opinion on this is, but he goes, why do we need to be in space? Why do we need to travel in space? Now, mind you, this guy's an engineer. So he's not some, person who's terrified of technology or anything. He's lived the world. He's lived a good life. And so, you kind of do go, he goes, look, we need to fix planet Earth first. And he's not talking about necessarily an environmental issue, although I'm sure he wouldn't have any problem with that, but he's probably more talking about the political nature and well-being and just learning how to behave, I mean, it is amazing to think that an AOC could go into space. It seems almost mutually exclusive that if we could find a way to travel deep into space, we wouldn't have educated morons. You can always have people that are ignorant to something, right? But career liars, and it gets really old really fast. And to think that we would actually penetrate space and meet another alien, and someone like AOC gets to talk to some other race. I mean, it's just terrifying to think that they might just come and wipe out our entire planet. So one sort of rhetorical question is, are we ever going to get like brilliant people on average and then explore space? Or are we going to always have morons who believe in complete fiction as science, and we're still going to go into space? Is Greta going to be allowed to talk to someone in space, someone out there in the universe on our behalf? I mean, could you imagine? Isn't that just utterly terrifying? One of the things that keeps coming up in my head, and I don't know if there's a whole show to this, but we'll just bounce around some certain space topics because it's something that fascinates me, the whole issue of the space station, SpaceX's new Starship. Someone just reported in the comments today that NASA has moved its 2024 moon return to 2028. All right. Let's just keep moving it until we actually get there, right? Let's actually develop real technology to really get there this time. But the thing that keeps getting me is the space platforms. A platform is the technology you would use to get to a particular destination or accomplish a particular task. Putting a rover on any foreign body in space requires platform A. The platform that will take a man to a foreign body in space, allow them to exit, habitate, experiment, then get back in this vehicle and return back to Earth safely, that's platform B. And if you think about all the space hoaxes without thinking about the platform paradigm, you're going to miss some glaring evidence that this stuff is all a hoax. Case in point. As I always tell you folks, if you're going to put a rover on Mars, you would most definitely put it on the moon first. You would. as a practical test of the technology. They don't do it because to put a rover on the moon, especially like the last 2 species we put up there in the last 20 years, they have the capability of driving to the landing zones, the landing spots of the Apollo, lunar landers. I have to put up my hair here. NASA's only submitted proof that the lunar landers are there immediately failed the scale test. They showed us these photographs of the lunar module's landing gear, right, the 4 feet on the moon. And when someone asked, okay, what's the scale of this photograph? And they said 1 pixel equals so many feet. And so you look at this picture and they're like, oh, so the lunar lander just became 4 times as big as it was in the history books, because the 4 little dots are too far away from each other by a factor of 4, roughly. All right. That's a little mistake that all of your people who think that we went to the moon, who are all butthurt in the comments, or some old relative of yours who tries to make you feel bad because you're awake and they're asleep, just show them that one. Hey, look, Grandpa, this is proof we didn't go to the moon. And don't start making up a bunch of goddamn excuses why this is suddenly legit just because you can't deal with it. It's funny because on the fence of conspiracies, we have a couple things going on here. We have someone that might be able to prove to us that a conspiracy took place by showing us, the overwhelming majority of the factual evidence, which proves some aspect of what you just saw was definitely fake, or was definitely a conspiracy to create something and make it look like something else. All right. Then you have the conspiracy person who has seen so many of these things and is so awake with legitimate conspiracies that they can now get creative in their mind, always making everything a conspiracy. Now, that actually does have value, right? But then you have the opposite side of the game, which is someone that can always dig out a conspiracy back into the official story. And I've got friends of mine who are geniuses at this. I mean, it's unbelievable how much proof you could show these individuals, and they will just go into this cognitive dissonance mode where, well, I can't imagine this, and this is probably this, and this and that, and I'm sitting there going, hey, a 110-story building fell in 6.5 seconds. Well, maybe God in the temporal fabric of space and time, gravity didn't work. Maybe there was a gravity wave, and all right. At one point, it gets mind-blowing, So NASA's sending all these probes to Mars in 93, 98, 2001 to 2003, and just recently. Well, where's the probe to the moon? So let's just say someone on that side of the fence goes, oh, I'm going to give you a big excuse why that doesn't happen. They don't have enough money to do both, and so they just do the one. And of course, they're going to go for the more exotic one, which is impossibly far out to get to. But now, we're supposed to be going back to the moon. 2024, now supposedly postponed to 2028. All right. So you need to research a lot about the moon. And given that we know they didn't go, and even if they did go, the information that they got from the moon was infinitesimal compared to what they need now to build what they're claiming to build, which is moon bases. We're not going to leave anymore. We're staying. It's going to be Space 1999, like the show on TV. You're going to test platforms on the closest body in space. You are. If they have enough money to pay SpaceX to do anything, they've got plenty of money to send something to the moon. Since they have lied so much about how easy it is to get something onto Mars. I mean, do you realize we don't have any failed missions to Mars? Last failed thing we had to Mars was That little probe that the dude in England worked 40 years of his life to build. I think we were headed to Saturn, and we threw this thing out on his behalf. And then what happens? It crashes into the surface of Mars, and they essentially say that that guy was so incompetent in his rocket design or his spaceship design that it didn't work. Truth of the matter is, his shit probably never left Earth, and they had to destroy it because they can't get to Mars, so they just time it. They literally, turn the thing on and forge where it is in space, or however they're talking to this little thing, if there even was any communication with it. And just about the time they're supposed to drop it, they do something else in our atmosphere to drop it. They destroy it, and then it looks like Britain can't create a probe. The real reason is that they can't get there in the first place. So the sad thing was, I read an article about that guy after it crashed, and he was devastated. He had worked several decades on this thing. Platform technologies. Now, officially, the Falcon 9, was it the Heavy Falcon or whatever it is, and the Starship and all that, all those are platforms. The Space Shuttle was a platform. Saturn V was a platform. And here's the thing. Let's rewind the 60s for just a second before we went to the moon. One, before we ever announced going to the moon, we had been working on rocket technology, all throughout the 50s. I don't know if you can hear that buzzing back there. That is a wasp shaving wood off of this awning thing to take it back to his nest. It's really hilarious to watch. Actually, I take that completely back. That's a palm tree of mine hitting the power line. I'm going to have that thing taken down. Just hope it doesn't burn to the ground. You have to call PG&E to come take it out. But we had all this rocketeering going on, launch pad explosions, tons of different species of rockets, all this stuff before we went to the moon. Okay, so according to NASA, let's say they did delay, it doesn't matter. We should be having tons of launches right now aimed at the moon. And, it's one thing to send up a probe that's going to drive off a ramp and start walking around the surface of the moon. I still think that's damn near insurmountable in terms of technology required. But I don't know of anything going on. They took the Project Orion project, and they're now telling you on the 2024 mission pages that that's what they're going to use to get to the moon. Apparently, this big giant Saturn V thing is no longer necessary. It's got to be a smaller rocket. With supposedly, I guess, equal or more boost power. Okay. What I'm interested to see is the following. If America continues to wake up, for instance, if Trump gets a second term and he starts really doing all the stuff that the QAnon guy keeps saying, which is, arresting people and da-da-da-da, we get this country cleaned up, the NASA and JPL and all these other SpaceX organizations are going to have a huge problem continuing a deception. Because we're not going to be in that gear anymore to be lied to through our press 24/7. So, either they're going to cancel that whole thing. They could come up with 1,000 excuses, budgetary issues, whatever. Deprioritize it. But if it were to fall back into the hands of the deep state, then we're going to go into double down crazy. AOCs will be normal. Idiocracy, the movie, will become real. And as much as Mike Judge wants to take a piss on Trump and say, oh, Trump is idiocracy, give me a motherfucking break. Okay? The Green New Deal isn't straight up idiocracy. Having senators that marry their brothers to smuggle them in through false immigration and they're still able to be, congresswomen? Are you kidding me? That's not it? fake global warming things that are taxing the public and all this. You think that's not crazy? Come on. Draining the swamp is the antithesis of idiocracy. It's really funny too, just to digress for 1 second. When I was a kid, it was all about business people becoming politicians. You almost always had to have some sort of success in your personal life in order to become a senator, a congressman, anybody on the Hill, president. And then, of course, we have the movie star thing that starts happening with Reagan. Jimmy Carter, he was a peanut farmer. He's supposedly a physicist. So you can see how that guy could get his way in there. Just don't pay attention to his brother. But today it's a joke. If you think about the space programs, they're going to be catalyzed in their fakeness based on who's running the show. Now again, you might have some old school folks that believe in sort of, again, it's better that we lie to make our country look better than it is to just tell the truth. You might have some of that. Trump might be one of those people. What I'm hoping about Trump is that he's not a guy that surrenders his common sense for someone who has a big title. Meaning, he's in the Oval Office in the first year, and at some point he goes, "Did we really go to the moon?" He asked some real senior Q clearance person. "Yes, Mr. President, we totally did go to the moon. What happened was that we faked the first mission, and so we got it right with all the rest. But we really did go on the first mission. We just didn't have live footage, and the call with Nixon was faked," and on and on and on. And then he, wanting to believe that, goes, "Okay." And then he starts, supporting and greenlighting and starting to talk about the moon missions during his political stomps, thus forging in history lies and his gullibility, or his patriotism is more important than truth. And I would say, if you stood before God, you're never going to come up with anything where you go, "Okay, God, well, there's truth over here, and then there's this thing I did." The other interesting thing is that we're in the age of the open source movement, right? It's been going on for 30 years, at least, in a very formal manner. For those of you not familiar with that, what that means is you write some code, you develop some technology, and it is put into the open source movement where everyone else can see your code. And the cool thing is they can use your code. You might think, "Geez, I've just sold my patent or given it away in the public domain." The benefit is that the world tunes your code, making it much better, and you get a copy of that for free. So you get a bunch of R&D for free, and in the end, the community made the best product. So we're supposed to be going to the moon. All right. Well, according to the fake world of idiocracy, China has put 2 rovers on the moon, one on the light side, one on the dark side. Their photographs that came back were the laughingstock of the scientific community. Absolutely, categorically fake, just like their space station with all the water bubbles that seem to fly up the mask of their astronauts. Israel attempted, failed, then we waited a week or so, then all of a sudden they said they had photographs. It's an image thing. India is doing its rover to the moon. So apparently it's super duper easy to get to the moon. Just buy the little Heath kit online and make sure you got a flathead screwdriver and a Phillips head and maybe some vice grips, and man, when do you want to go? What I find interesting is you've got people like Richard Branson trying to start that new airline. There's a few companies doing this where they want to put you in low orbit supersonic aircraft to get you from, say, from Los Angeles to Paris in 2.5 hours, 1 hour, whatever the timetable is, because you're going to be going so quickly. I think it's true that the first 2 or 3 pilots that worked for Branson died just trying to fly high in a vehicle. What I find fascinating about that is, okay, so it seems to be no problem to find rocket engineers to get probes to the moon. I mean, first time for a lot of folks, right? China has basically adopted the same playbook as America in the 60s, which is we're going to try and we're always going to make it because it's all being done in a Hollywood studio or out back in our dirt-covered hills, which we're just going to photograph in the color of dirt and then pass it around. I mean, wow. Put the balls on these guys, or the absolute naivete of whoever's running that program. And NASA, seems to have gotten a hold of their photographs and washed them all out to gray. So you have gray versions and you'll have brown versions. So how is it that Branson can't get a vehicle to fly safely to just go from Los Angeles to Paris, but you can get to the moon and drop a rover off and take photographs and have those beamed back home? No problem at all. No problem at all. I think if we want to really start turning in the screws on NASA during this commitment to go back to the moon, we have to just consistently say, what's your platform? What's your platform? What's your platform? And I think this time around, we're going to use their answer to prove that they didn't go in the 60s, which is the following. Ask them how they're leaving Earth's orbit. Ask them how they're steering to these far-off objects. Now, again, the moon is obviously in our sights constantly, but they're going to need to do the elliptical rubber band slingshot orbit. And again, just go back to all my old episodes. You're going to need to get into Earth orbit with so much power that either you're automatically increasing your orbital journey, which again, the slingshot theory in its opposite escape velocity is where their engines break down, their fuel systems break down. You're in low Earth orbit, which means if you just stay there with no push, your orbit will eventually deteriorate and you will hit the Earth, just like the space station. Was it the Mir space station from the Russians? They crashed in the late 90s. It crashed because they couldn't push it back out. Alright, so now you're in low Earth orbit. Now, while in Earth orbit, you are this, again, teeny tiny thing. The Earth is several orders of billions of times bigger than you. And you're going to have to turn on a new motor and start to create this ever increasing, which means your motor is going to have to continue firing as you're going around the Earth to create this really close orbit on the bottom side and this increasing elliptical orbit around the backside of whatever direction you want to go, right? So when you pull a rubber band to shoot it, you're pulling it away from your target, right? So you want to hit that beam over there, you pull it this way. You want to hit the beam over there, you pull it that way. Same thing with the elliptical slingshot theory. That slingshot has got to be pointed directly at the direction you're going to need to slingshot to. And what's fascinating is the absolute astronomical difficulty in pointing the slingshot at the right direction should just cancel it out in your head. Again, the Earth, as far as NASA says, is 24,000 miles around. But when you're in 200 miles up, it gets a lot bigger than that. And as you continually increase this elliptical orbit, you're talking about, I don't know how far away from Earth you'd have to be. Probably 2 Earths away in your final breakaway orbit. But in order to break away from the Earth's gravitation in your last gigantic elliptical orbit to do the slingshot thing, you're going to have to introduce more power. And then you're going to have to fly away from the Earth while you're being sucked towards the Earth, so that when you hit that last moment where it's supposedly going to slingshot you, it's a fun word to say, that it's going to perfectly slingshot you at the target in space. Now for the moon, it's 236,000 miles away on average. It's a little bit bigger, but still, this is an impossible thing to do. You know what I mean? It's kind of like shooting a rubber band at a bunch of bottles that are 30 feet away, and you're going to put that rubber band directly on the bottle on the top of the bottle of the one that you want. It's ridiculous. When it comes to Mars, you've got a planet that's out there hauling ass around the sun. We're hauling ass around the sun. Of course, we're going to go when it's closer to us on the orbital window opportunity. And now, if you're off any level of degree, and I mean it must be 10 places to the right of the decimal, you are not hitting Mars, right? You have blown it, because millions and millions and millions of miles away, you are going to not hit your target. But at the same time, we know how fast we can get things to move in space. I saw a video the other day, it said the fastest object that we've ever personally been responsible for was an object that went, I think, 175,000 miles an hour. That's fast. But Mars is traveling faster around the sun. So how do you catch up with that? Most of you know that if a Bugatti was going right by you on a highway at 200 miles an hour, and they get the window rolled down, somehow that's going to work, and you got a can of soda or a water bottle, and you're like, hey, I'm just going to throw this in the window, and you catch it so that you can have water in your car. The relative impact is going to be 200 miles an hour hitting that bottle. If you throw it in someone's face, you're going to absolutely crush their face completely. Doesn't work. So you're going to have to hurl this bottle with your hand 200 miles an hour to just make up the relative speed, so that when it goes in the window, the person just grabs it and it's going exactly the same speed they are. But I think you know that it's probably impossible for the human body to throw something 200 miles an hour. So you got a problem. How are these probes just perfectly landing on Mars? How are they perfectly getting in orbit around an object that's moving quicker through space than we can push any object off the surface of Earth? But you might say, oh, well, that's where the slingshot theory really works. Really. You have to not only match the speed of the foreign object, but you have to exceed the speed of the foreign object, and you have to be so utterly perfect in your marriage of the orbital grab of Mars that you're going to have to hurl the object just a little bit faster than Mars is traveling through space, which is technically impossible. It is. Because you're going to have to overshoot Mars to create this descending orbit, which has been animated for the probe that was the sent around Jupiter. They just know that no one thinks about this stuff. No one understands the basics. So where it is out of sight and out of mind, they tell lies and they steal billions of dollars. Now with the moon, this should become measurably easier, but you're going to have to do it. And I think that SpaceX is talking about doing this with their Starship program. You build a space station in space, and I mean a real space station. Sort of like the stuff you've seen in 2001: A Space Odyssey, like the stuff you see in Star Trek. It has living quarters. It is a real place. It has a dock in space, just like the docks you see where the Enterprise, has been maintenanced several times in different movies. So the opening scene of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, it's amazing when you see the Enterprise for the first time since 1969, 10 years later. Because once we have a ship in space, traveling in a secure orbit around Earth, that supposedly, okay, it's going to need to be able to go through the Van Allen belts with no repercussions. That means the hull of the ship is going to have to be some sort of Faraday fabric. It just is. It's going to have to rely on the fact that it can divert a solid frequency of electricity, right? Faraday only works if you have a solid / stable frequency of electricity. If the frequency of electricity goes up and down in any violent way, it will penetrate the Faraday fabric and start to dismantle or go inside the vehicle. Now, to give you some perspective, it's pretty solid. A lightning bolt that strikes your car, as far as I've ever heard this example, it does not travel inside the car. Now, I also heard something that was funny when I was a kid. They said that people used to think that if you wore rubber shoes and you were standing on a conductive material and that material gets struck by lightning, that you would be secure because you're wearing rubber shoes. And I believe it was my teacher at the time that said those shoes would have to be 7 miles thick to ward off the amount of electricity that's going to be screaming towards your body through those shoes. So there is some folklore around methodologies to protect the occupants inside. We saw the new spacesuits because there were 2 females that did a spacewalk. Apparently it's the first time that 2 females have claimed to do such a thing. I wasn't aware of that. I mean, we've had multiple females on the space station for at least a decade, and you would think that both of them would go, hey, do you want to go outside at the same time? Yeah, sure, let's do it. Hey, we're going to make a world's record happen too. Yeah, great. But this new spacesuit was hilarious looking, and quite frankly, it might be hilarious looking because it actually works. I don't know. You still see the rubber fingertips, and again, when it's really, really cold outside, which space is, it's going to freeze your fingers in a split second, right? What they're telling you is that you could reach into some, with those gloves on, you could reach into 280 degree boiling water. I don't know, that's not quite boiling, I don't think, but 280 degree water, and you're not going to feel anything. I mean, you can sit in it all day long, hours and hours and hours and hours, no problem. And then you could put your hands in negative 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're not going to feel cold at all. Yeah, it seems like it's going to make sense, right? Now, one of the listeners, I'm going to digress and talk about space for 1 second, made a great comment, and it's actually addressed in my very first episode in 2015, which is, I believe this person's a flat earther, and they were saying that you can't have pressure in any sense of its definition without a container. And that's where I get into the 3 models of the universe that could possibly exist, which is you have a finite container for the universe with a finite amount of matter in it. You could have an infinite container with a finite amount of matter in it. You could probably have infinite container with infinite amount of material in it. Now again, we don't think of things like that at all, do we? It's really tough for us to think about infinity, infinite mass in the universe. So how would you get pressure? How would you get ethereal winds to have any pressure model at all without a container? Well, maybe there is a container. We don't know. Maybe that is the absolute de facto proof there's a container. There is the string theory, which I think in its pure definition is probably incorrect, but I think the guy might be onto something, which is that somehow the ethereal matter is truly connected to either itself or some other medium provides its train tracks, and the train tracks are finite, therefore you get a finite traveling medium of which ether could travel on, and then you start getting a pressure model again. But it's definitely a great question. And for some reason, my episode, I think, on the Space XYZ PDQ, it got a lot of folks who I don't know if they know each other or whatever, but 2 or 3 folks said in the comments, it sounds like you're a flat earther, but you're scared of being called a name, so you're not willing to admit you're a flat earther. You know, the truth is I'm an expanding earth person pretty much 100%. So again, I'm an open-minded dude. I want to see the flat earth community either succeed or not necessarily fail, but learn a whole lot more about the universe by addressing the idea that we are in a round ball, just like bubbles in water. Now, I wanted to throw you another model of scientific discovery, because when I think about the 20th century that I was born in and spent a tremendous amount of my life in, you think about 1900 and where we were in 1900. And if you were to go back to 1900 and talk to folks, they're right on the precipice of a lot of amazing things. Film has started, right? It's still silent movies, but we got moving pictures now. That's a pretty huge increase in technology. Henry Ford very quickly created the Model T, so we have now cars. Trains had been around for quite a few years before that. I mean, almost 75 years before that in any functional methodology. And so trains, with the refinement of oil and obviously using coal, were able to combine to make this steam engine technology. So you could get anywhere you needed to be in the United States of America as the 2 railroads connected from east to west. What else did we have? We had the invention of the telephone based on the primal technology of the telegram. And the telegram was huge because the telegraph technology was all based on the wire that transmitted that information from one station to another. If you haven't researched it, it's utterly fascinating that they found that there was a lot of anomalies in moving electricity down a wire because of its lack of conductivity. They had to do a bunch of tricks to get it to transmit over long distances. So once that was figured out, the telephone merely transmitted more complex data over the same lines. Electricity. Tesla brought us the AC system, alternating current. So there was a tremendous amount of technology that blew up out of the first 2 decades in fact, even the first decade of the 20th century. We're about to conclude the second decade of the 21st century, and I would say that we are way behind the curve of new technology that is really making things better, because the internet existed as it exists now from the HTTP protocol in the 90s. Yes, we're building much more elaborate technology on top of that technology. That's good. Electric cars, well, Tesla was able to use, lithium batteries to take it to the next level. I just read an article today that a guy burned up in his car, his Model S, after crashing it because he couldn't get the damn doors open, and of course the batteries are burning at just a terrifying rate. In terms of rocketeering, well, if you really studied the rocket platforms that put things into orbit for communication satellites, military satellites, all that kind of stuff, all the spy stuff up there, the Falcon, the Falcon 9, the Heavy Falcon, all that stuff, it is really off-the-shelf technology built at the best level of accuracy that it's ever been built. But there's French rockets that look exactly like all of the rockets that SpaceX puts together. I mean, they're almost physically identical. What SpaceX big claim? Well, they can land those boosters back on the ground and reuse them. Again, I'm not sure how much money they're actually saving when doing that. Project Orion attempted to solve the problem of the Van Allen belts, flew once without man in the capsule, then they canceled the project, and then supposedly now it's resurrected, and it is going to be the platform, part of the platform to get to the moon again. Again, I haven't seen any pedestrian film the SpaceX boosters landing that I trust. We're not invited. When I talked about the SpaceX meeting at the warehouse in the desert on this really windy night, and Elon Musk is out there theorizing about what's possible, and all the fanboys are there writing everything down for their blog or their whatever newspaper, what becomes apparent is that no one in the audience is asking any real questions about the technology. There's not a single person in the audience that is willing to talk on the mic, at least, to say, really, is this really possible? It looks like, this is fake. But how was that whole thing orchestrated? It was orchestrated like a Hollywood set. Big silver starship thing. It's like a big movie prop for some 1930s Buck Rogers, as I said before. It's lit beautifully. So he's standing next to an object that is essentially a psychological presence attack for any of the fanboys. And so, probably even you and I both would be standing there looking at this thing going, wow, that's a beautiful thing, even though it's got rivets on it. Again, just like Hollywood props in the 30s. It is my suspicion that the folks that go along with these fake assertions that we're going to be doing all this amazing stuff in space, they understand the presence attack. They understand the fact that folks want to believe. And if you break down any one of the fanboys, think about the average accolade that a kid gets by going to one of these press conferences and learning firsthand what the story is going to be. One, we know that aerospace in general, is a black box for 99.9% of the world, meaning nobody knows any of the technology, any of the mathematics. And so they try to enter that realm to have a conversation on a discerning level, and they immediately have to give up because they simply don't have the brain power to have the conversation. In a way, that's protection. How about all the times you've heard that settlers from Europe got to the Americas and the Native Americans saw them and thought they were gods? They rode on horses, which they'd never seen. They had these weapons that could shoot you from a long ways away. Even if they had a sword, it was just a beautiful, amazing piece of technology. So until the Native Americans understood that the arrow is still very, very formidable for any one of these quote-unquote gods, they surrendered until they figured it out. And I think it's interesting that the history books are pretty unanimous about the fact that the Native Americans became absolute crack shots with rifles and all the technology that was being brought over to hurt them and essentially genocide them down to a tiny reservoir of folks, right? It's my belief that we're not asking the right questions, that we're not invited to those press conferences. What would happen if you were to walk into a crowd of people that are wanting to believe all of this stuff, and you get to that mic and you pin Elon Musk down on some forgery? What if you walked up and said, look, I am from Conspiracy Red Pill website blog, and I don't think that your boosters are really landing back down on the ground in Florida. I want you to pay for a ticket to fly me to the next landing of those boosters, and I want to be able to live stream the landing. I don't need to be right next to it, but I want to be close enough that when I film it, there's no question that this is real. Well, you'd probably have a bunch of boos in the audience, right? Because what you're doing is, if you're right about your skepticism, then you're stealing the accolades from every single person that wants to believe. Every person that goes home to their wife or their parents or their husband or whatever, and they're saying, I learned this, I learned that. You know what Elon Musk said? I learned all about their mission details, and I can recite it to you. Well, I guess you're a genius then. I think we also have to do a little bit of math and realize that there's a lot more of them than of us. And you know how mob rules works. If everybody else wants to believe the emperor has clothes on, is it worth it even mentioning that he doesn't have clothes on? Will you get lynched because you're, again, robbing everyone of their fantasy. If we are about to land on the moon and start space stations and all this other kind of stuff, especially in 4 years, even if it's been delayed another 4, for me, I'm okay if they tell the truth and they simply go, well, we thought we could do it in 24. We ran into this hurdle, so we're moving it 4 years ahead because we really want to get there. I support that 1,000%. But we should be looking at today, already, their plans for their schematics of what are you building these buildings out of? How are you keeping them airtight? What sort of environmental systems are you bringing to the moon? Is it going to be some fusion reactor that can create oxygen molecules out of something else? Can you take the dust from the moon and refine it? Because when they lied about going to the moon, they lied about what the moon is made out of. And I remember, again, like in the 80s, in Omni magazine, the Japanese had thought up a really cool hexagonal structure that you could create where you could stack them up, put them side by side, and you could create essentially a space station out of hexagonal boxes. And where you want a door to go between 2 hexagons, you just either don't create it or you cut it out. And now you can walk through this beautiful, super resilient structure. And again, they keep telling us that all those bumps on the moon are craters when they're really volcanic eruptions. So if you really want to be there, what you have to do before you can pick a site for a space station is figure out where the volcanic eruptions are still alive so you don't build on top of it. And maybe that's in the Sea of Tranquility, who knows? But we see these craters, these volcanic craters, erupt all the time. Like I keep saying on the show, I show you the photograph every single time of the plasma, the white glowing plasma energy coming out of the center of the moon, spilling out into a crater. It's because it's a volcano, folks. I've seen a couple of YouTube videos in the last month about something called Crater Lake. I forgot exactly where it is, but I believe it's in the United States. I believe it's in Oregon or something, up in that area. But it's called Crater Lake. Why? Not because it's a crater from a meteorite from outer space. It's because it's a volcanic crater that filled up with water. And now it is dead as far as I understand. My concern is that I wasn't completely, sentient. I was born the year that they went to the moon, a few months later. A month later, I guess. So I don't know if what I'm about to say is true for NASA, but it's definitely true for SpaceX, and it's sort of... It could be construed as a little scary. Not terribly scary, but it's a force against truth if these agencies turn into cults. A cult would be an organization that amasses followers that will believe anything the cult tells them. Because a cult will get violent eventually if they are forced to give up their cult beliefs. What do you think all the religious wars of the world have been about? My God against your God. You can see it in the flat earth versus round earth movement. I am shocked that expanding earth, which is my belief system, is still pretty much unknown. I mean, there's folks that know it, but there's no movement around it. It will tell you more about how the earth was formed and how cosmic objects formed than any other theory that's out there, for my money. So I want to put this episode out there to kind of get at the nitty-gritty of what we should be paying attention to in the very near future, which is platform technology. Not only the platform to get to the moon, but the platform to survive on the moon. They don't have to tell us exactly how everything works, but they should definitely start revealing their plans before we're going to sit there and swallow it all, right? So I think that's about all I've got for that. Anyway, take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.